They called them the Westons in whispers and half-jokes at the diner counter, that quiet family out by the bend, the one whose porch light never went out and whose mail piled up like fallen leaves. For years the town treated them like a myth, an old house with too many curtains, a family that kept to itself. Then people started to stop coming back from the river or the late-night bar, and the myth changed shape. My name is Daniel Mercer. I make short documentary videos about small-town mysteries, cases the big networks call closed, and the locals call better left alone. I've seen enough missing person reports to know the difference between a runaway teenager and something that wants to be called by a softer name, disappearance. When the Westons' name came across my feed, an anonymous tip, a shaky Polaroid of a blue-eyed little boy looking like he hadn't fully decided whether he wanted to smile, I booked a ticket the next morning. The town is older than the highway that skirts it. You reach it by a road that narrows into a creek entry corridor, and past a certain bend the telephone poles lean inward like listeners. People still hung laundry. There was the smell of wood smoke and a sentiment the city has traded for neon, privacy, not paranoia. At the diner they slid me a coffee and a look, the kind that weighs the cost of conversation. It's the same everywhere. People who have kept their heads down often think of the town's history as a private property. A woman named June, who owned the antique shop near the square, told me the Westons had been here longer than most records. Old family, she said. Nobody likes to talk much about the Westons. But they always sent out invitations for dinners like church bulletins back when the little ones were still walking. She had the habit of speaking in past tense about people who might be alive. That's how towns protect themselves, by tucking present horrors into the grammar of memory. That boy in the photo, she said, I remember him once, ran across my yard with a frog in his hands and no fear at all. He had bright eyes like someone who watches people do things and takes notes. Her fingers toyed with a paper napkin. Then, one day, nothing. Mail stacked. Lights on. Empty plates on the porch table. Her description of the house matched the photo, a clapboard house on a small rise, a white fence a little too neat, a metal mailbox painted the same hue as the shutters. You would pass it and think the family had perfected secrecy, you would not think anything of it. Except for the stray details you'd keep in your pockets like stones, an extra dog bowl near the back door, a row of well-polished shoes all the same size, flowers always planted at the garden's edge, but never dead. The kind of order that implies someone is keeping watch even when there is no one to notice. People in town tended to be practical. The sheriff's office had a file thicker than some folks' marriages. Missing persons, there's a rhythm to them, names, dates, times, the phrase, no signs of foul play, appearing like a stamp meant to close a wound. With the Westons, the stamp had never quite stuck. Families reported the missing as last seen leaving a bar at 3 a.m. or walked toward the river. In the Westons' wake were variations, left for a walk and never returned, drove out of town and were not found, went out to the porch and just weren't there. They were small contradictions that are the first signs of a larger pattern. I found the house on the second day, mid-afternoon, when shadows are honest and the wind doesn't pretend to be mysterious. The white fence had a padlock, new and brass bright. The porch light was on although the sun still poured itself across the yard. When I walked up, the airtight quiet of the place felt as orchestrated as a stage set. The back door had been left slightly ajar, like an invitation or like a trap with poor manners. Inside the living room, laminated family portraits smiled down from the mantel, 3 generations layered in frames. The faces were too similar, the smiles the same tilt. It was a detail I would learn to recognize, the way a family that practices silence tends to copy expressions until emotion looks like habit. On the center table was a dishcloth folded with mathematical precision. On the table beside it, as if for a guest who arrived earlier than everyone else, were 2 plates waiting. One had crumbs, as if a meal had been eaten and the dishes not yet cleared. No fingerprints, no sign of rush, only the hum of an appliance from another room and, beneath it, a low, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone practicing a steady beat on the inside of their skull. I set up a small recorder and a camera. My editing room in the city is sympathetic to quiet, it makes room for the small noises other ears miss. In that house the noises did not remain small. A refrigerator made a pneumatic sigh, pipes adjusted their minds, and then something I did not expect, a soft, deliberate voice, not coming from any visible speaker, saying, almost conversationally, "Dinner's at 7." The voice was not loud, it was the kind of voice you would believe came from a person across the table, offering a familiar invitation. If you are a documentarian, there are rules you live by: be accurate, be patient, and never anthropomorphize evidence. But sometimes the world makes a mockery of rules. I pocketed the cassette from the old tape player by the fireplace, an ancient thing, its reels like hollow moons, and took it back to the hotel to listen in the dark with headphones snug against my ears. The recording was mostly ambience at first: wind, a far-off dog, a creak of wood. Underneath, there was a low tone, tonal enough to be deliberate but too human in its rhythm to be a faulty appliance. Then at the 2-minute mark, there was a sound like someone humming. A lullaby. It was the kind of tune that carries a promise to children: sleep now, I'll watch over you. It seemed harmless on its own. It was not harmless when the human voice that followed said, quietly, "Don't be afraid of the taste." I rewound the tape so many times my thumb went numb. The phrase sat in the head like a pebble, small and smooth but impossible to discard. Taste? Of what? Why invite people to dinner with the promise of a taste that the human voice preemptively cautioned not to fear? The logic was perverse, a half-joke disguised as civility. At night I walked the paths the missing had walked, the roads that led into woods and thin fields. Towns accumulate rituals, gravestones, memorial benches, odd shrines of plastic flowers left on telephone poles because folk need to make marks. I found markers that belonged to the missing: a fishing hat pinned to a tree, a child's rain boot buried partly in the mud, a hand-stitched scarf looped around the post of a green bench. People kept things as if the objects could hold memory steady. An older man named Harlan invited me to his porch after sundown. He had lived lifelong near the bend of the creek, and his hands had the slow weathering of someone who keeps objects honest. "You don't ever just show up to those folk," he said flatly, in a voice like someone who has measured the worth of words by how much they cost. "They have rules. Old as the house. You break the rules and the house makes another place for you." "You're speaking in metaphors," I said. "You want metaphors?" He hummed and tapped the ash of his cigarette. "A neighbor, 60 years a man, used to say the Westons run their house like a kitchen. Not cooking for the living, mind you. But cooking to fix a hunger that isn't ever satisfied. That taste talk, people joked in my bar about what that meant. My son thought it was some silly game until he smelled it one day on the north wind." Harlan's voice dropped. "Meat's my business. We butcher cattle. I never heard anything in my life that made my throat close like that smell." The word hung between us: taste, smell, hunger. But Harlan, sensible as he was, refused to trade rumor for accusation aloud. "If you want to know," he said, standing and balancing on the porch rail, "go watch the west field at dusk. If the Westons come out, especially in the fall, you'll see things that don't look like the city. You'll see how they keep order." That evening, I did as he suggested. From the privacy of an overgrown hedgerow I watched the house as the sky began to bruise. The Westons did come out. It wasn't a procession, more a careful parade: 2 older adults, hunched but upright, a younger couple, a teenage boy, and the boy from the Polaroid, the boy with the bright eyes. They walked with purpose to a long wooden bench near the orchard, carrying covered dishes, the way church ladies carry casseroles to a potluck. They sat, arranged their plates, and began to eat. You always think you understand hunger, that full is full, hungry is the opposite. But there's a kind of hunger that isn't about the capacity of a stomach, it's about the appetite for a story you cannot get any other way. The Westons ate with small, reverent bites. They spoke in low murmurs. The boy with the bright eyes met my gaze once and smiled, a smile like someone learning how to accept a secret. That secret bent the light in the evening. The smell that rose, when the first plate was uncovered and steam and seasoning surrendered to the air, was the smell of a Sunday roast and an undertow of iron. Harlan was right in the way a man with experience can be right and still not wish to be. I could have left when the first dish steamed. I didn't. I lifted my camera, set the focus where the steam would not blur the face of that child who had looked at me, and pressed record. For a moment, a single heartbeat, the laughter among them seemed ordinary. Then the boy at the end of the bench pushed a plate his way. I couldn't see clearly what was on it, only the glisten and something that reflected like bone. The sound I recorded then on my camera, later in the editing room, when screens become honesty machines, was a quiet chewing, the kind that does not immediately imply scandal but that slows you down the way an engine misfire slows a car. You sense imbalance, and you cannot hear the engine without thinking of collapse. I left after dark. I drove away with the recorder humming in my lap and a fatigue that settled like old cloth. The tape held smells I couldn't remove. In the hotel, playing back the footage at speed in empty rooms, the scene held its ordinary prosaic charm. But in the silent frame, something shifted, a hand at the edge of a plate. A ring on the ring finger, old and plain, glinting in the lamplight. The boy's plate was empty then, but only for a blink. The editing showed me a cut where the boy looked away and his mouth was the smallest shape of contentment. Sometimes we talk about monsters as creatures that possess teeth and fangs, but real monsters prefer manners. They eat politely. They pray. They offer you a taste and say not to fear. That isn't an excuse to dramatize, it's a description to be taken literally. For those who keep houses and for those who keep secrets, the language is still the same, words meant to soothe, hands meant to welcome, plates meant to mask what fed them. I sent messages that night to everyone I knew. You want the story? I typed. I'm close. People sent back jokes and care and the occasional concerned emoji. A friend told me, bluntly, be careful. Don't be the one who gets curious where curiosity eats. I thought it was clever until the words ate at me. I went back the following morning with more than curiosity. I brought a small team on the pretext of making a short piece on rural traditions. 2 people came, Lena, who handled sound with the deft hush of someone used to lying microphones down like sleeping children, and Raj, my camera operator, who has a tolerance for odd hours and long drives. We parked in the hedgerow and watched the house. The family did not come out, not at noon. They kept their windows curtained like eyes in a cave. The dishcloths were folded the same way. The garden flowers were trimmed and wet with morning dew as if someone had just tended them. We noticed, though, other signs. At the back of the property a small patch of newly turned earth had been smoothed, circles flattened as if a plate had once sat there and been washed away. We found, beneath a sheet of galvanized metal propped behind the shed, a set of labels, small cards with names. Not all were the town's names. Some were from neighboring counties, some were first names with nicknames and dates that did not add up. G. Marlowe, May 12, last seen. The cards were clean, their handwriting careful. Someone had logged what they took, the way a butler would note guests' wine. When I asked the town's historian, old Mr. Ellis, a man who files memory like coins, about the family, he went quiet not from grief but from calculus. The Westons have their ways, he said slowly. They were good for the first when the harvests were poor and the winters too long. They brought company. You take a neighbor in, you eat with them, or you don't, and you keep your stove lit. But once the table is set a certain way, people forget what they are eating. That's the thing that bothers me. People stop checking what's inside. They only check who's sitting with them. I asked him point blank if he'd ever heard of cannibalism in town. He took a long time to answer. We are not barbarians, he said. But there are older cultures, ifs and rituals. We live near old soil. Some habits don't die. They only wait to be reintroduced. His eyes did not leave mine, he was not being cryptic for my edification. He was giving me a map. That night Raj did more than peer into the windows. He noticed a single child's shoe in the grass under a mimosa tree. It was size small, scuffed, and crusted with a faint residue, a muddy tack that might be tracked from a riverbank. Beside it, pressed into the damp, were footprints leading down to the river and then stopping, as if whatever had walked there had been lifted away. We slept badly, because people who sleep badly tend to relive moments with the same detail that makes them a story. My recorder hummed overnight on the table, and when at 3 in the morning I checked the tape, there was a new sound, a whispering not in any language we knew. It was rhythm and sibilance, like leaves rubbing against leaves, like prayers not meant for daylight. Over it, a voice, not the same as the one at the table now, but older, had a cadence that suggested habit, not malice. "We keep the table," it said. "I've told you all this slowly, with the meander of investigation, because horror is not in the first step you take into a house. Horror is in how the house arranges itself around you when you stay." We had evidence now, labels, recordings, footprints. We had the smell. We had a boy who met my eye and did not know the name for the silence in his family's house. And then, finally, we had an invitation. It came the way invitations come in certain old tales, delivered at dawn, slipped under the hedgerow into the crook of Raja's boot. It was a folded scrap of paper, coffee-browned at the edges, in neat handwriting. Only 2 words inside. "Join us." The paper was not signed, but the shape of the letters reminded me of the ring I had seen on that plate, plain, old, like the ring on its owner's hand. The town still had rituals. It still had a family that called the house and the table its own altar. We had crossed whatever line matters in such places, curiosity, the bravado of evidence, and the house had noticed. When you read this, you may think I should have burned the note, you may think I should have gone to the sheriff. I thought of that. I taped a photo of the note to the wall of my hotel room and watched the reflection of the city's neon blink against it like an accusation. The rational thing is always a possibility. But there's an undying human thing, the desire to look at the face of a truth rather than listen to second-hand warnings. We are ridiculous creatures. We accepted. We arrived that evening at 7. We pressed our palms to the gate and entered. The porch light was, still, on. The plates looked set for us. The air smelled like roast and iron and old ritual. A slow breeze touched the napkins. They had placed a chair for each of us. On the edge of my plate was a small folded note. It said, simply, "Thank you for coming." I sat. I will not describe what came next in the blunt registry of detail. Some images, once painted, do not need the exact pigment of the palette to be terrifying. What I will say is that the way the Westons were hospitable felt like a lesson in how politeness can be weaponized. They spoke in terms of food and weather and small biddings. They asked me about my work and listened like collectors. Their eyes were the kind of eyes that note the flavor of things, items, moments, people. At the moment I later understood as a pivot, the hinge between ordinary and the unnameable, someone at the table said grace. It was a solemn line, a sentence that bound the meal and the company together. In that sentence, there was a phrase I would never forget. It sounded like a benediction, but the cadence was slow and precise. "May what nourishes us remain here." The words were harmless until they were not, and then they were a kind of lock. You realize with a slow collapse that the world is not made of laws so much as habits, and habits are how houses keep their own. I felt that lock. I felt the way the light seemed to bend inward. I did not scream. That is not nobility, it is a lapse in reaction when your brain decides the body is in a place it cannot call home. When I left, when some impeccable part of me seized a moment and ran, my recorder was in my jacket. The footage would later show what it wanted, plates, hands, faces. But the audio kept something more honest. There was the lullaby again, threaded through the voices. And there was a small boy's whimper, "Don't let them taste you." Then a rustle as if a hand smoothed a child's hair. We left. We left with our mouths filled with the memory of a taste we did not name. The car was warm. The road back through the town seemed longer. Harlan's house glowed in the distance as if on a slow watch. We drove fast enough to feel muscles ache. At dawn, when the city makes you crave the rough edges you left behind, I wrote notes and tried to be a journalist. I typed until fingers cramped. I called the sheriff and told him everything, filtered through the professional language my job breeds because I did not want the world to collapse into sensations for the public to spit at like seeds. He sounded tired and said he'd send a deputy. "We don't have probable cause," he said in that voice law enforcement uses for things that will not be taken outside the courthouse. "If the Westons invited you, it's your story, Mercer." The next day, the gardener on the town square, an elderly woman with a kind of authority that comes from shoveling earth for decades, told me with a quiet smile that when the moon is thin and the harvest is poor, some families follow older recipes. "You can call them recipes," she said gently, "or you can call them habits your neighbors keep on a bad day." Her ears were like a net, she had caught things I had not yet admitted to myself. "You should go back," she said. "Not to feed your curiosity. Go back to see if they let you leave. When I drive back to that house in the dark now, I can still hear the undertone of the lullaby in my skull, like a television left on in a room where no one sleeps. I have the tape. I have the footage. I have the notes. I have also, despite logic, a reluctance that smells like someone who kept a secret because secrets are warmer than the cold that follows. The Westons invited us back 2 nights later. When I tell this part of the story, how a house calls you like a host and a feast that ends quietly, people tend to ask the same question: why would anyone do that? How could anyone follow a family that eats what is not theirs? I do not pretend to know the answer. I have ideas, old superstitions, families who hold rituals to survive, a hunger that is less about food and more about stopping the decay of memory. Some communities create meaning with myths that bind them. Some families, some people, bind themselves with acts that push everyone else to the edges. In the Westons' case, ritual and restraint and a recipe that tastes of bone and closing doors had folded into one practice. They were a family that ate, metaphor and fact braided together, to keep the house quiet. When you are bare with a story like this, you learn to notice the small things. A napkin folded wrong. A lullaby hummed in a key slightly off. A child who smiles before a stranger's joke finishes. The Westons were not grotesque monsters in the way you see in pulp. They were calm, well-practiced. They were civility in the place where civility turns predatory. They were not the caricature of horror, they were the neighbor, and the neighbor is worse because the neighbor can be real. I will stop this part of the record here, because story is a hungry thing that must be paced, and because the next step, what I found after the second invitation, what I recorded in the deep hours while the town slept, will require you to listen with the kind of attention that keeps the lights on. If you want me to continue, say the word, and I will give you what I have captured, the evidence, the voices, the names on the cards. I will tell you what we did with the tape, and where the sheriff placed his foot, and how the town finally decided whether to name the Westons a family or a danger. Detective Ramirez leaned back in his chair, staring at the photos laid out before him. What he saw didn't match the usual chaos of a murder scene. The house had been strangely neat. The beds were made, the dishes stacked, the furniture arranged precisely as if on display. And yet, blood pooled on the living room carpet in a wide circle, as though someone had deliberately drawn the family into one spot before striking. Even more unsettling was the lack of any signs of struggle. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no scratches on the walls. The family of 4, Daniel Harper, his wife Elaine, their teenage daughter Lucy, and 8-year-old son Ben, had simply vanished. Only the blood remained, and the eerie precision of their abandoned home. He tapped one of the photos, a close-up of a door in the basement. Its frame had been splintered, not from the outside, but from within. Something, or someone, had clawed its way out. "Sir," his partner, Officer Collins, said as he approached. "Neighbors say they heard, noises the night of the disappearance. Screams, maybe. One of them swears he saw lights flickering in the basement windows. But by the time he went out to look, everything was dark again. Ramirez nodded, his eyes still on the splintered wood. We need to get inside that basement. Later that night, Ramirez returned to the Harper house alone. He wasn't supposed to, protocol demanded he wait for a full forensic team. But something about the place gnawed at him, like a whisper in the back of his skull. The house was too quiet, the air too stale, as though it hadn't been touched by life for decades rather than days. He descended the basement steps, each creak echoing through the empty rooms above. At the bottom, the air grew colder. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on rows of shelves along the far wall. Jars lined them, dozens of them, each filled with cloudy liquid. Ramirez stepped closer, and his stomach clenched. Inside the jars floated things. A finger. An eyeball. A small, malformed jawbone. He stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't a random crime scene. This was deliberate. Planned. A collection. Something moved in the corner of the basement, just at the edge of his light. He swung the beam, heart hammering, but found only an old wooden chair, its legs shackled to the floor. The leather straps on the armrests were frayed, stained dark with old blood. And then, faintly, he heard it, a scrape against the far wall. Slow. Rhythmic. As though nails dragged across stone. Hello? Ramirez called, his voice cracking despite himself. The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Ramirez forced himself closer to the wall. He pressed his ear against the cold concrete, holding his breath. That was when he realized it wasn't a wall at all. A thin seam ran across its center, like a door hidden beneath the paint. From behind it, something exhaled. A deep, rattling breath, hot enough to fog the cold cement between them. Ramirez stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. He had to leave, he had to call it in. But before he could reach the stairs, the sound of chains dragging echoed through the hidden chamber, growing louder, closer. And then, 3 sharp knocks pounded against the other side of the wall. Ramirez's breath caught in his throat. 3 deliberate knocks. Not random. Not an echo. A signal. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet betrayed him, pulling him back toward the hidden seam in the wall. The flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam wavering across the damp concrete. The air had grown heavier, each breath thick like tar. He ran his fingers over the seam, pressing at the edges until he found it, a nearly invisible handle embedded in the stone. His mind screamed, "Don't do it." His training screamed, "Wait for backup." But some unseen force tugged at him, urging him to look, to see. With a sharp pull, the hidden door groaned open. The stench hit him first, rotting meat, coppery blood, mildew. Ramirez gagged, covering his nose as he aimed his light into the narrow space beyond. The beam illuminated a tunnel. The walls weren't brick or wood but carved earth, damp and pulsing with condensation, like the belly of some vast creature. The floor sloped downward, vanishing into thick shadows. And lining the walls, were cages. Ramirez stepped inside, his boots sinking into the wet soil. In the cages were bones, some scattered, some neatly stacked like trophies. A small, rotting teddy bear lay half buried in the dirt, its glass eye reflecting the beam. Then he saw movement. At the far end of the tunnel, a shape crouched in the darkness. Too tall to be human, too thin, its limbs bent at grotesque angles. It was gnawing at something, the wet sound of flesh tearing filling the silence. The creature froze as his light touched it. Slowly, impossibly slowly, it lifted its head. Its face was a mask of stitches. Patches of skin sewn together, mismatched eyes bulging from sockets that didn't belong to the same skull. Its mouth stretched into a grin too wide, teeth yellow and jagged. Ramirez stumbled back, his light shaking wildly. The thing cocked its head, the sound of bone cracking echoing down the tunnel. Then, in a voice that didn't sound like one voice at all but a chorus of many, male, female, child, it whispered. "They're still here." The cages rattled. Bones clattered. Ramirez's blood turned to ice. He swung his light wildly, and in one of the cages, he saw them, eyes. Dozens of them. Faces pressed to the bars, pale and hollow. Not skeletons, not corpses, but people. Still alive. "Help us," one mouthed silently, lips trembling. Another stretched out a skeletal hand through the bars, skin hanging like wax. Their eyes begged, but there was no sound. Only the creature's heavy breathing. Ramirez staggered back toward the door, desperate to slam it shut. But when he turned, the doorway was gone. Just a solid wall of earth. The tunnel had closed around him. The creature's laughter followed him, a warped chorus of voices that grew louder, closer. The air grew hotter, choking, and the tunnel seemed to pulse as though alive. Ramirez realized, too late, that he hadn't found where the Harpers had gone. He had found where they were taken. The sound of the creature's laughter ricocheted down the tunnel, vibrating through Ramirez's skull until his teeth hurt. The cages clanged, their rusted bars rattling as skeletal hands stretched outward, clutching desperately at the air. Ramirez's pulse hammered in his ears. He forced himself to steady his light, but the beam seemed to shrink under the weight of the darkness, swallowed by it. "Please," a woman's whisper drifted to him, thin and cracked. He snapped his light toward the voice. A cage no larger than a kennel. Inside, a woman crouched, her skin gray and paper-thin, eyes bulging unnaturally wide. Her lips trembled as she mouthed again, "Please." Before he could respond, the creature crawled into view. Not walking, crawling. Its limbs folded wrong, knees and elbows bending backward, claws dragging grooves into the damp soil. It moved with a speed that defied its awkward shape, scuttling along the wall like a spider. Ramirez raised his pistol, finger twitching on the trigger. "Stay back." The creature stopped. Slowly, deliberately, it tilted its head, lips stretching into that grotesque grin. Then, in a voice stitched together from too many throats, it whispered, "We were here before them. We will be here after you." The cages erupted. Screams, hoarse, inhuman, filled the tunnel. Hands reached through bars, some with fingers missing, some covered in sores, clutching at the empty air like drowning swimmers. Ramirez fired. The shot echoed like a thunderclap, dirt raining from the ceiling. The bullet tore into the creature's shoulder. Black ichor oozed, steaming as it hit the ground. The smell of burnt hair and copper filled the tunnel. The thing didn't scream. It laughed. And then it spoke with his own voice. "Run, detective. Run like you always do." Ramirez froze. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, he saw his daughter's face staring at him from one of the cages. Pale, lifeless, but unmistakably hers. "No, no, no, she's alive. She's at home," he stammered, backing away. His rational mind tried to grab onto the thought, but the tunnel bent reality itself, warping memory, twisting truth. The creature lunged. Ramirez fired again, missing as the thing vanished into the ceiling. Claws scraped above him, dirt showering down as it skittered overhead. Ramirez bolted deeper into the tunnel, boots splashing through filth. The cages seemed endless, lining the walls like grotesque museum displays. Some prisoners banged their heads against the bars, blood trickling down their faces. Others simply stared at him with glassy eyes, lips moving silently. Finally, he stumbled into a wider chamber. The ceiling arched high, supported by beams of rotting wood. At the center stood a crude altar of bones, lashed together with sinew. Candles, black and half-melted, flickered on every surface, though there was no breeze to feed them. On the altar lay a book. Its cover looked like stretched leather, stitched with rough thread. It pulsed faintly, like a living organ. Ramirez's light trembled as he moved closer. Symbols carved into the dirt floor glowed faintly red, shifting and writhing as if alive. He reached for the book, only to feel hot breath on his neck. The creature was behind him. But when he spun around, it wasn't the stitched-face monster. It was a man. Tall, gaunt, dressed in what looked like a doctor's coat, though the fabric was yellowed and stiff with age. His eyes were sunken hollows, but his smile was sharp, practiced. "You shouldn't be here, detective," the man said softly. His voice carried an accent Ramirez couldn't place. "This place was sealed for a reason. These were my patients." The word lingered in the air like a curse. Ramirez tightened his grip on the gun. "Who the hell are you?" The man's smile widened, teeth impossibly white against the shadows. "The one who taught them to hunger. The one who made them perfect." And then Ramirez realized, this wasn't just a monster's den. It was a laboratory. The Harper family hadn't simply disappeared. They had been transformed. Ramirez's knuckles whitened around the grip of his pistol. The man in the stained doctor's coat, if he was a man, stood between him and the only object in the chamber that pulsed with power, the book on the altar. The stranger's eyes glimmered faintly in the candlelight, as though lit from within. His voice was calm, patient, almost soothing. "Do you know why they scream, detective? Not from hunger. Not from pain. They scream because they remember." Ramirez swallowed hard, the air thick with the scent of blood and rot. "What the hell are you talking about?" The doctor's grin stretched wider, his lips cracking at the corners. "Memory lives in the flesh. Every cell, every nerve, it holds on to what it has seen, what it has felt. When I peel it away, when I rearrange it, the memories bleed out. They become voices." As if to prove his point, the cages erupted with sound. Voices layered upon voices, men, women, children, overlapping, begging, laughing, screaming. Ramirez clutched at his ears, but the noise came from inside his head. The faces in the cages writhed, some splitting at the seams as stitches ripped, revealing fresh layers of mismatched flesh beneath. The doctor strolled casually toward the altar, his footsteps silent on the dirt floor. "I began in the hospitals. They thought me brilliant. A pioneer. They sent me the broken ones, the insane, the lost, the forgotten. Who would miss them?" His eyes gleamed. "But then I discovered the truth, sanity is irrelevant. Flesh is malleable. Anyone can be improved. Even families." Ramirez's stomach twisted as the meaning hit him. The Harpers. The doctor's chuckle was low and pleased. "Ah, yes. A beautiful experiment. A father's strength, a mother's warmth, a child's innocence, all stitched together. Do you understand, detective? Alone they were fragile. Together they are eternal." Ramirez's light flicked across the cages again. And he saw it, faces that shifted, blurred, merged. A child's mouth sewn onto an adult's cheek. A woman's eye staring from a man's forehead. The family hadn't been killed. They'd been fused, reassembled into something grotesque and endless. He raised his pistol, fury drowning out the terror. "You sick bastard." The doctor moved faster than Ramirez thought possible, closing the distance in an instant. His hand gripped Ramirez's wrist, unnaturally strong, bones grinding under his fingers. The gun clattered to the dirt. "You think this is evil?" the doctor hissed. His face twisted, the skin around his jaw splitting to reveal raw muscle beneath. "This is salvation." With a violent shove, Ramirez was thrown against the altar. The book pulsed brighter, reacting to his presence, the symbols on the ground glowing like hot coals. The voices in the cages grew frenzied, a chorus of pleas and moans. "Read it," the doctor commanded. His tone was not a request, it was absolute, a command that resonated in Ramirez's bones. Open it, and you will see. You will know what it means to transcend. Ramirez shook his head violently. No. But the book's cover shifted under his hand, warm and slick like living flesh. His fingers twitched, against his will, as if something inside the pages was pulling him. The stitching along the spine throbbed like veins, beating in time with his heart. The doctor leaned close, his breath hot and foul against Ramirez's ear. You've lost before, detective. Your daughter, your wife, you couldn't save them. But this will make you whole again. This will make you strong enough to never lose anything ever again. For a split second, Ramirez saw them. His daughter's face. His wife's smile. Reflected in the sheen of the book's flesh. Reaching for him. Calling his name. His chest heaved. His hand trembled on the cover. The cages shook violently, hands clawing through the bars, voices screaming in unison, "Don't open it." And for the first time, Ramirez realized, they weren't begging for their own freedom. They were warning him. Ramirez's hand trembled on the pulsing cover. Every beat of the book matched his heart, each throb tugging him closer to surrender. The doctor loomed over him, a silhouette of stitched flesh and madness, whispering promises that coiled like serpents in his mind. "Open it, detective," the doctor hissed, voice both honeyed and venomous. "See the truth. Become more than a man. Become eternal." The faces of Ramirez's wife and daughter shimmered again in the book's sheen, their lips mouthing his name. He wanted to believe, God, he wanted to. But beneath their softness he saw the seams, the stitches, the same twisted work that had fused the Harpers into nightmares. He wrenched his hand back, breaking the book's hold. "No," he spat, voice raw. "You don't get to use them. Not anymore." The doctor's smile curdled into a snarl. His skin rippled, seams splitting open as though something larger pushed to get out. His voice deepened, layered with hundreds of others, until it shook the chamber itself. "Then you will join them." The candles blew out. The chamber plunged into choking darkness. Ramirez snatched up his flashlight, its beam slicing through the black just as the doctor's body convulsed. It was no longer a man. The skin peeled back like wet paper, unfolding into a writhing amalgamation of flesh and bone. Too many arms clawed at the ground. Too many mouths screamed in unison. Its torso split open, and inside, Ramirez saw faces, dozens of them, pushing against the skin, eyes wide in agony. The Harpers. The patients. All part of him. Ramirez staggered back, grabbing his pistol from the dirt. He fired again and again, bullets sinking into the shifting mass. Each shot made the creature howl, but it did not fall. Black ichor rained, sizzling as it touched the floor. The cages rattled violently. Prisoners, if they could still be called that, pressed against the bars, their screams forming words. The fire. Burn it. Burn it all. Ramirez's eyes snapped to the candles, their faint embers still glowing in the dirt. He thought of the book, throbbing on the altar, alive, a heart that fed the nightmare. Holstering his pistol, Ramirez grabbed the candles, knocking them into the pulsing symbols carved into the ground. The wax flared, flames leaping unnaturally high as if the room itself wanted to burn. The doctor creature roared, lunging at him with a dozen arms. Ramirez snatched the book from the altar and hurled it into the fire. The reaction was instant. The chamber shrieked, a sound not of collapsing earth but of something living, dying. The walls pulsed violently, dirt raining from above. The cages split open, their prisoners screaming as fire spread through the symbols. Some collapsed in ash, others vanished into smoke, their suffering finally ending. The monster thrashed, claws raking across Ramirez's chest, hot pain tearing through him. But the fire spread faster, wrapping the doctor's mass of flesh in searing light. The voices inside him wailed as the stitches ripped apart, faces stretching into nothingness. Ramirez crawled toward the tunnel, every breath ragged, every movement agony. Behind him, the chamber imploded in fire and screams. Then, silence. He collapsed onto the damp earth. When he opened his eyes again, he was outside. Dawn had broken. The Harper farmhouse stood behind him, smoke curling from its roof. But where the basement door had been, there was now only solid stone, as if no entry had ever existed. Ramirez lay there, staring at the rising sun, blood soaking through his shirt. His mind reeled, but one truth burned into him. The Harpers had never truly disappeared. They had been consumed. Transformed. And now the book, the heart of it all, was gone. Or so he prayed. Because as the ambulance arrived, as voices swarmed around him, he could still hear it. A faint chorus, whispering beneath the crackle of fire. "We're still here.